good rule of thumb is to kind of look at life and say, hey, what does healthy community look like? The challenge is the Sabbath. The challenge is, where do you get your rest?
Right.
We used to try to take Fridays and Saturdays off and kind of have like this 5-day work week with an understanding we'd probably work 1 or 2 nights as well. And that kind of got you to 50 in a hurry. So, yeah.
Between the Grooves is hosted by James Kurtis, music director and morning man in the Greater Toronto Area on Joy Radio, and Aisha Woods, Grammy-nominated singer, songwriter, and musician. Together, they talk with artists and industry insiders to discover our connection between music and faith. You can connect with us on Facebook or Twitter at Between Grooves. Now, here's James and Aisha.
Hey, it's James. Aisha is off today, so I'm going solo on Between the Grooves for this episode. Actually, not really. I have a guest with me in studio, Cliff Cline. He's been doing the Christian music thing on and off for the last 10, 15 years, I guess, as a singer-songwriter. He's also a worship leader. We're going to chat about his role as a worship pastor in a local church and what he's been up to since as well. Cliff Cline on Between the Grooves. Cliff, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Not too bad. You're not, I would say, a household name, but perhaps you are in the city of Oakville, which is where we're broadcasting from right now.
Right, yep.
You were, past tense, worship pastor at Hope Bible Church in Oakville.
Yep.
How long were you there?
5 years.
5 years?
Yeah, and as a fan, we actually attended there for 10 years, so it's a long time there, actually. Yeah.
How did you get the gig?
Just being involved. I was part of the worship team as a volunteer for about 4 years, and one day kind of sat down with Robbie, and he had a coffee and said, "Hey, would you be interested in coming on staff?" So it was kind of natural, very organic.
That's kind of cool. And you're just kind of name dropping Pastor Robbie, but he's the senior pastor of the church.
Right.
And so, that's significant when the senior pastor says to you, "Hey, we'd love to have you come on board."
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.
It was really good.
Was it a full-time job?
Yeah, full-time job for those 5 years. Yeah.
Okay. I got offered, we've had this conversation before, but I got offered in the church I was attending at the time. I was their audio guy, and I got offered a part-time gig being their audio guy whenever there was an event. And I said, no, I can't do that because it will be a full-time job with half the pay.
100%.
So that's why I was asking. It was a full-time gig for you.
Yeah, full-time.
And so as a worship pastor, it's interesting. Aisha can't join us today, but she's also a worship pastor in Orlando. Yeah. What does a worship pastor do? Like, what does your job entail? And it's a loaded question because very often what happens in a church is you get hired on for one role and then you become good at that role. And then it's like, well, you're good at that. Here's this and this and this and this to do as well.
Yeah, sure.
So in the end, what was your job? What did you end up doing? That maybe wasn't necessarily the role of a worship pastor.
Well, it's interesting because, those that don't know me and can't see me, I'm older. And so even as I was brought on staff, it was for more than just worship. It was, in fact, overseeing worship and communications, and we did a lot of conferences and events. And for those that didn't know, it's a fairly large church.
Yeah.
So when I was there, it was pushing 4,000, and post-pandemic, it might be a little less than that. But so a very busy job. So I actually had a whole worship department I oversaw, and then a production department, as you were talking about, I oversaw, and then a communications team, and then an events team. So it was a very busy job, Percentage-wise, how much of the job was in charge of the music side of things versus more the events side? Because you're right, it is a bigger church, so there's stuff happening in the church all the time, right? Yeah, I'd say it's about 25% music all the time, because the events involved music. So it was kind of like 25% of your conversations revolved around music planning for events or Sunday services, which we had 3 and 4 at different seasons, and then prayer nights once a month and all that sort of thing.
I attended a church and I was very involved in the church. This was years ago. I think we were between youth pastors. And so me, a buddy of mine, my brother, and another guy, we kind of ran the youth group for a good 6 months.
we were known as the Four Horsemen, which is probably not a good, description. But we ran the place. In fact, what was kind of neat about it is that when the youth pastor left, we probably had about 40 youth at the time, and we were able to maintain that number. Not that numbers is everything, but we were able to maintain that number throughout the summer and into September, October, before the new youth pastor started. And the reason why I mentioned that is, we became good friends with some of the higher ups in the church, if you want to call it that.
Sure,
It's not
leadership,
really,
whatever.
Yeah, it's not really higher ups. It shouldn't be that way in a church. But, with the pastors and whatnot, especially the new youth pastor that came on board. And we heard the expression where when there was an event, it was labeled as an A event or a B event. An A event meant as an employee, as a pastor, you had to show up at this event.
Yeah.
A B event was, well, if you can attend, great. If you can't because of family commitments, then that's fine.
Yeah.
So prayer nights, Sunday services, were they all A events for you?
For me, absolutely. Yeah. Prayer nights are spiritually a big deal for our church, and just an important pillar, like one of the pillars of the church. And Sundays, of course, whether or not I was leading and actually involved musically, I was always kind of overseeing and supporting everyone that was there. So, yeah, I was always there for everything.
How often did you actually lead worship?
It's hard to say. It went in seasons. When I started, I thought it would be once a month, but I probably averaged a lot more than that over time. So a couple times a month probably, plus usually I was leading at all the conferences and events.
Right. When you were leading on a Sunday service, like the main congregation versus any other events or side events or whatever else, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with what Hope Bible Church does as far as the worship is concerned. But is this where one person's leading the entire time, or is it kind of a tag team effort where you might lead the first couple of songs and then somebody else jumps in for a next couple? Is that how
Absolutely.
it works?
Yeah. And in fact, philosophically, we really went after that. So trying to encourage and develop, and so we'd have 2, 3, 4 singers, and usually everyone would get to lead part or all of a song. So that was great. And especially when you're doing 3 services, that's very helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is it the same team for all 3 services?
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. I mean, the volunteers are unbelievable, right? They'd be showing up at 6:30 in the morning and go until 1:30 or 2. So
yeah,
it was a full day for them. Yeah.
I was calculating once in my head. This was when I was either engaged or I was already married, and I was the main audio guy. And I was actually, the church I attended, we had 3 services, 2 in the morning, 1 at night. And I actually calculated how many hours I worked at the church. If you want to look at it, I mean, how many hours I volunteered, but how many hours I actually worked, because a sound guy is there before the service starts. You're there afterwards to clean up. And then you're there again in the evening doing the exact same thing. And it was like an 8-hour day.
Yeah.
So when you consider about volunteers, it's a huge commitment, especially when you have multiple services on a Sunday morning.
No, it was a big thing. And so there was a constant need to recruit and develop and try to make the pace right, for the volunteers. Kind of once a month seemed to be about right for most. Yeah.
Right. My brother's a pastor, a lead pastor in a church north of Toronto, and I've shared this before, but I'll share it again because it kind of relates. His philosophy has always been that as a pastor, he gets paid for a 40-hour week, but he expects himself and the people that work full-time at the church to put in 50 hours. And the reason behind that philosophy is that if he expects people who work, the lay people in the church, the volunteers who work their full-time jobs 40 hours a week or 37 and a half or whatever that magic number is, and then you expect them to volunteer at the church, then it should be no different for the people that work for the church as well.
Yeah.
So for you, what was your work week? Like Sunday's a work day for you.
Sure.
As it is for my brother who's a pastor. So what was work for you? And do you have a break? Do you get a downtime?
Yeah. So it was, Hope was a unique situation because it was big enough that we were kind of 6 or 7 days a week is how much the programming was running.
Sure.
Whether it would be men's ministry, women's ministry, whatnot. And of course I had some oversight over all of that. So we had a very similar kind of ethos, which was, if I were attending a church, I would typically volunteer once or twice a month, but not maybe for 3 services. So maybe I'd volunteer 5 hours a month, or potentially 10 if I was like a super committed person. And then, of course, you have things like small groups where you're getting together. So to be a part of community or church life. And so I think that's about right, 45 to 50 hours a month for a pastor or a staff member seemed about right. When you were asking earlier about mandatory attending events, that you can see where it starts to get huge, right? Because you have special events or men's events or conferences or prayer nights. And so you
especially at Christmas time. Can you imagine all the events you have to attend?
Yeah, it's amazing. December is nuts.
Yeah.
So it's I think that's a good rule of thumb. Is kind of look at life and say, hey, what does healthy community look like? The challenge is the Sabbath. The challenge is, where do you get your rest?
Right.
We used to try to take Fridays and Saturdays off and kind of have like this 5-day work week with an understanding we'd probably work 1 or 2 nights as well. And that kind of got you to 50 in a hurry. So
yeah. You mentioned, specifically mentioning or talking about the Christmas side of things, like the whole month of December is basically a write-off for any pastor.
Correct.
And so when we have family functions, my side of the family getting together for Christmas, all the extended family and stuff, really the schedule revolves around my brother.
Right.
Around his schedule. And usually it's after Christmas, between that small little amount of time that you have between Christmas and New Year's to get together. But other years it's been even after New Year's because of the schedule being so crazy busy for him.
Yeah.
So, but also the talking about the Sabbath, because I think that's really important to note. And that's not just for pastors, that's for everybody.
Correct.
Right? Because it's so easy to get sucked into work, volunteer, that you don't actually get the rest.
100%.
And I think that's probably something I learned during the pandemic was like, I get some rest. Like finally discovering what that rest was, and thinking, I need more of this. You know, we don't plan any events on the Sunday, and by events I mean we're not going to go visiting people.
Right.
If we get invited over, it's like, no, sorry, Sunday can't work for us, because I don't want to be the guy when we're visiting somebody and 6, 7 o'clock in the evening rolls around and says, guys, we got to go.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the bad guy if we're having fun.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I have a job to go to the next day, and I have to be alert and awake for that job to get there. Number one, let alone actually doing the job. Yeah. And so we try not to plan any events on a Sunday because of that. So Sunday tends to be that Sabbath, and it doesn't have to be a Sunday for everybody. It could be a different day of the week, but having that time. So when you were on staff, Sunday being a work day, what day was your Sabbath?
I really tried to make it Friday. So that was kind of like the first day of the weekend, if you will.
Right.
You can't get around that Sundays are coming on Saturday. And so you're kind of checking in by at least after dinner, if not before, and there may even be some things that came up. So Friday was the safest day. Wasn't ideal for family time, obviously, because all your kids are at school and whatnot. So you kind of have to work really hard on Friday nights to connect with family and Saturday mornings.
Right.
But kind of by the time Saturday night rolled around, you're in work mode. Yeah. And getting ready, and same thing, you're up at 5 a.m. and off to work. So
yeah, and it's like you said, Sunday's a long day, especially if you have multiple services in a bigger church where you would have multiple services just to accommodate the volume of people that are
100%.
showing up.
Yeah.
For your worship team, what was the philosophy? Like, obviously, everybody loves to volunteer. Everybody thinks they're great, and I can play the keys or I can sing really good. So how did you? I use the word control that, because obviously you have to decide if they are actually good or not. Everybody thinks they can sing good, but sometimes they can't. Sometimes they get a little thing with pitch or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
How did you handle people wanting to get involved, and what did you do to steer them in the right direction?
Yeah, so I arrived and the systems were largely there. Probably tweaked them a little bit, but we had an audition system, and it used to be a live one, and we changed it to video, which I don't know if that created a barrier to entry. I think it made it easier for some and harder for others, and we always tried to help people, but definitely an audition process, right? And so we would take singers through both melody and harmony singing, and players would have to play through different things. So Yeah, it was. We definitely had a gate, and the big thing for us was not to make that gate one where it was so detrimental to people getting involved. So we also had a whole development program. So Sundays were obviously a big service, a very, very high bar in terms of what we expected people to be able to do and show up ready to do.
Yeah, that's a big thing right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Just don't show up and, what are we doing today?
Yeah, no, you have to come ready to roll. And so we started using our youth, which actually our youth group was like 300 plus, and ran 2 services, junior high and senior high. And so we would use that as a place for people to learn all kinds of things. I mean, we use technology so much in church, right? With backtracks and click tracks and in-ears and all this kind of stuff.
Don't tell people. Don't tell people the secrets. Yeah.
But so much work, right? And then literally just being able to play more complicated parts. It's not as simple as it was in the early days where you're just chording through, right? You're playing lead lines on keys and on electric, and you're expected to play certain bass lines. And so we had that. We had men's ministry and women's ministry, all these places that people could learn both the skills that they needed to be a part of a band, so learning how to play with others, but also just gaining that confidence of being in front of people and realizing there's this edification call that we have as worship leaders to be able to kind of inspire and by example lead in worship and gain the confidence to be demonstrative and realize that, at the back of the room, if you're doing nothing, that's literally what's coming across. And when you're doing more, my hands raised there, people are, oh, okay, I can do that. I can follow that. If that's in my personality, I can do that as well. So giving people permission to just let go and actually worship God. So,
what about the production side of things, the tech people and stuff? Was there a similar audition process for that?
I would say no. It was far more of a, if you're willing, we'll train you. So there was definitely a development track. You don't just, we're going to sit you at the soundboard on a Sunday.
Yeah, go nuts, have fun, enjoy, don't screw it up.
But heavy training. So they did an amazing job. That team did an amazing job of just recruiting. Again, lots of places. The youth area had their own kind of little worship area with a fully teched out board, digital board that was the same technology as the main room. So if you learn there, you could transition those skills in the main room, or even we had an in-ear mixer backstage on the main stage. So if I can call it that, but in the main sanctuary. So yeah, there was a lot of jobs. I mean, we had video, live stream. We were running 4 cameras. Obviously, we had a back room for digital, for all the switching and all that sort of thing. So there was lots of different roles for production, and the team did an amazing job of just recruiting, developing, training, being patient, giving people skills, and transferring people. I like this better than I like working the camera way better than I like being back in the video switching room. So
right. So obviously, a lot of people involved in a typical Sunday service.
Yeah.
So what do you do when there's a no-show? Like either they just haven't shown up and you don't know why, or they've called in sick, but not enough notice to get somebody else in. Is it just you have a hole now, or you fill it somehow, or?
I think over the years we learned we just had some redundancy all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So it did happen for sure. And it happened a lot during the pandemic when we were allowed to do certain things, but you still had to have folks show up.
Yeah.
So there was things we could do. Like we could take a camera person who was capable of running Pro Presenter and then have that camera just be a static shot. Or we had
running back and forth and let's zoom in for this next shot, run back again. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. And we had floater staff members that would in essence be doing a tech director job, but we could do without that on a Sunday if necessary, or at least some of the time. And then sometimes, the first service you were short, but the second service you were able to get someone to fill it for the next 2.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Scrambling, no doubt about it. But by and large, an incredibly committed group of people who would have to be, deathly sick not to show up. So there was no issue with commitment, that's for sure.
Rehearsals, weekly rehearsals, or how did that all work with the worship team?
We used to have a Saturday service and 2 Sundays, and we switched to 4 Sundays at one point. And at that point, we're just like, we can't we can't do another rehearsal like on a Saturday and then do 4 services. So we started rehearsing early in the morning. We started rehearsing at 6:30.
Okay.
And so that did change things because we lost an hour of rehearsal time. So we used to rehearse fairly long amount of time on a Saturday for the whole weekend worth of services.
Right.
And we just had to, again, it was a little tough. We had to raise the bar and say, okay, you really have to show up ready to play every note.
Yeah.
And all we're working on is kind of like feel and maybe some on-the-fly changes because we're just feeling something different in rehearsal with the group that we have together today. But you really have to come prepared.
And is there a cutoff time on that rehearsal if it's on a Sunday morning?
Absolutely. You're going to try to make me remember. It was 25 minutes before the service started,
okay.
so that ushers could open doors and start letting people in.
I only ask because what drives me nuts is when there's a church, any church for that matter, any church, and you maybe are visiting and you show up and they're still rehearsing. And I use the word rehearsing versus sound check because it's two separate things.
Yeah.
And especially if they've had a midweek rehearsal already, then what are you doing on Sunday morning? You've already had your rehearsal. Yeah. Maybe you need to fine tune some transitions and, flow or whatever else, but you don't need to be doing the song verse 1, chorus,
right.
verse 2, chorus, especially when it all sounds the same, unless it's sounding completely different for each stanza or each
right.
part.
Right.
And that's what drives me nuts. It's just a rehearsal. It's like, well, you're just having your own praise and worship time now, which is, I suppose if that's what you want to do for your team, great, So, yeah.
Yeah, we combine it all in one. We do, for all intents and purposes, an in-ear check, which acted as a sound check for the band.
Right.
And then the rehearsal would combine as a sound check for the audio engineer.
Right.
And he would dial everything in for all the different songs.
Yeah. And that makes sense because the in-ear, for a good sound guy, really all that really matters for the sound check is keeping the band and the musicians and the singers happy with what they hear in their monitors or in their in-ears.
Yeah.
After that, they can go ahead and rehearse and stuff, and the sound guy can now, fine-tune the EQ or fine-tune the mix or whatever else. They don't need to be involved in that.
100%.
Unless it's like, I've done this in the past where it's the drummer where you just want to make sure you've got the right levels for each mic on the drums, multiple mics, 6 or 8 mics or whatever. And it's like, what I would do is I would say, okay, just wail on the drums for the next 20 seconds. And I'm just going to quickly, not going to EQ because I've already done that, but I'm just going to adjust the levels and stuff. And then I'm happy. Okay, you guys go do whatever you have to do.
And ironically, in our situation, with in-ears, that one of the big advantages, of course, is the whole band can be playing the song, and out in the worship center, the audio engineer could have muted everything and just be working on the drums.
Right, exactly.
So we combined it all, and we also combined video cues, right? So the video team would be there, and especially for live stream, they would practice switches. Okay, this person's leading on this song, so if we're going to do a close-up, remember, you better have that close-up dialed in, that sort of thing. So that's what the time is for, and that's why you want your video people there ahead of time so 100%. They know what's going on. Write it down or whatever they need to do so they know what's happening. Exactly. Sometimes people, I think, it's like the camera people would show up. It's just like, okay, we'll just wing it. Figure out. Oh, looks like they're leading this. I better zoom in real quick. But being prepared obviously makes a lot of sense. It does. Yeah. It's all part of what we have to deal with in our current technology. Sometimes you wish for simpler times, but for the folk that are watching at home, or who are watching later because they're away on business or whatever it might be, it creates I like to say it's less distraction, right? So it's just, if I don't have to think about, you mentioned someone singing in tune or not in tune, but if I don't have to think about why am I watching someone tuning their guitar when I can clearly hear someone is singing a lead part, that's what I want to be following. So those things can take people out of the moment, and you're trying to give them an ability to, even in a remote way, meet with God and not be distracted.
With multiple services, did your church require musicians and singers to stay in the service, like the duration of all services, or they booted out? Like, what was
we did one.
There?
We did one. You typically attend the service with friends or family.
Okay.
And so whichever was, I actually usually sat through a couple. I usually always sat through the first one, so I'd understand, the full scope, because you don't hear the sermon until the first. That's
Yeah.
one thing you don't get a rehearsal for.
Exactly.
And so just making sure you understood that, especially if you're leading and you get back up and there's a response song, and being part of that service. And then my family usually came to the noon, so I'd sit back in and do it again at noon. But
Right.
yeah.
So enough about all of that stuff.
Sure.
Let's talk about your music, because you're not just involved in leading worship, but you've got your own solo career, as it were, music that you've been doing for a while. And
Yeah.
and I guess I first became familiar with your stuff maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago? Would
At
that be about
least.
right? At
Yeah,
least 10
at
years
least.
ago?
Yeah.
But you've obviously been doing that a lot on the side anyways,
Yeah.
and now it's become more focused. So tell me how it all started as far as that's concerned, because a lot of people that lead worship in a church don't necessarily have an artist career, a solo career, or record music or anything like
Yeah.
that. They just kind of have their own little thing going. But it seems like what's happened a lot recently in years, in the years now, is people that have any kind of following. I don't want to sound too simplistic or too unspiritual,
Yeah.
but if you have a following, or if you have songs that people resonate with, you very often have the opportunity to start recording that stuff. So is that kind of what happened with you, or did you always had that music thing happening?
Yeah, I'd say I've always had that music thing happening, and I think I've gone through all these different seasons, right? So way back in the day, you may have even played the group I was with, Heart, Mind, and Soul.
I've heard the name.
Yeah,
I
that
don't know if
would
I
have been.
played it here, but somebody
Yeah.
might have before me.
Well, I might have been Jim Leake.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So in the 90s, but yeah, music's always been, writing music and singing music has always been a passion, and I would say that worship music, certainly in my early days in music, was so different. Right, it was more of the song leader and the choir, and way more hymny, and you might have gotten a little bit of the gospel music starting to come in, but choruses, a lot of Maranatha feel, and that wasn't my vibe back then.
Right,
I was into kind of writing, for lack of a better term, pop music, and so it's always been in me, and I think the seasons I've gone through, done lots of recordings. I did some secular stuff. I did some jazz stuff with some guys in Toronto, which was ridiculously fun, to be honest. But I ended up in these last, say, 5 years of being in ministry, trying to even figure out how to write worship music, which I've done a little bit, but not much. And I actually kind of found that I'm not good at it. I'm better at just writing songs. And so for the last 2-3 years, just in my own kind of private time, all these songs, and COVID brought out some songs. And I just started realizing I'm better at, and I enjoy more writing songs that I would not call worship songs. They're Christian songs,
Right.
songs of faith, but and so that's what's been developing. And so, just as it became clear, the Lord was kind of leading us out of full-time ministry in the way that we had been the last 5 years. There's some things that happened. We moved from Burlington to Grimsby.
That's a little bit of a commute.
Yeah, a little bit. And we had this vision for putting a little studio in the backyard, which we just completed this summer. And that gives me the opportunity to go out and get noisy any time of the day or night I want to. And so it's just been a joy. It's just, things are starting to bubble up, and a lot more music is starting to come out again. And it's easier because I think it's the kind of music that I enjoy listening to, enjoy writing. And over the last decade, I'd say I always thought I'd just go into a studio and have an engineer bring the band in and have the engineer. And then just with technology changes and with exposure to some really good friends who are good producers and engineers that have taught me a bunch of things, I've started to enjoy even just creating the whole thing.
Sure.
And then just getting help where I need it, as opposed to so I'm trying to figure that out. I'm trying to figure out again how I can be a little bit more, I hate to say prolific in kind of any other way than just do more. I want to get more stuff out there more consistently and get it at as high a level as I can make it, and hopefully bless others with it.
So you're doing some other stuff as well, and you'd mentioned this in an email to me. You've started a company. I guess it's like a consulting business?
Yeah.
So what is it all about? I'm really intrigued by it, because obviously you've got a lot of knowledge, you've got a lot of experience. What are you doing in this?
Yeah, so music as the dream of doing it full time in a pure artist way, obviously never came to be, and so my quick life path was kind of did the band thing for about 7 years, spent about 6 years in finance business industry, and then I transitioned into not-for-profit, and I worked for a charity out of Guelph for 5 years, and then I started. It's the same company, Idea Praxis, coming out of that, and worked at that for about 5 years. And ultimately what I found when I was working for the charity is I was doing fundraising, I was doing organizational stuff, I was dealing with, all the growth that we obviously wanted to do, because you grow, you do more good, right? And so we were a feeding charity, and we had some programs in Haiti during the earthquake, which is a whole nother thing. Did a lot of overseas work in Africa and partnering with other organizations. And we actually did a ton of feeding in Canada, helping out food banks and other Christian organizations like the Good Shepherd or churches and whatnot with food pantries. So you start to learn all these new skills. And I started to go out and just help charities and say, hey, listen, maybe you don't have the money to hire someone full time. But I could fractionally work for you 1 day a week or this many hours a month and help your fundraising grow or whatnot. So that's what we did for Steph and my wife, and I did that for about 5 years, helping people with anything, websites, social media, fundraising, marketing, all that kind of stuff. And organizational stuff too, just like how do we put things together? How do we make things work? Optimization. So I love that stuff. It sounds kind of weird. As a musician, sometimes that's not the most normal thing to have those in your personality, but I really like that stuff. So
I can see a big need for that anyways, because a lot of times when you have charities, you've got people in place that don't have that skill set.
Right.
They've got the ability, they've got the heart.
Yep.
But they don't have the ability or the know-how or the experience to do a lot of that stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah, and you have to have a passion for it, right? If you can see how, one of my friends who worked with me for some of those years or all of those years at Sparrowway, he jokes because I trained him on, he was in logistics and I trained him how to use spreadsheets and he hated it, just hated it. But he always joked about how, I seem to actually like that. And it's like, well, I can see it's a tool that helps us do more. Yeah. As simple as that, right? Yeah. And so I can link up with the passion that a founder or even just a leader in a charity has for helping or for sharing the gospel, and I can say, hey, we can do more of it if we become more efficient, and that's good for stewardship, that's good for donor dollars, and that's also just a great story to tell people as you walk through life and try to do the Lord's work.
Yeah, and from a charity standpoint, a lot of it is numbers.
Yeah.
And so having that financial background is certainly helpful because you can measure stuff. I mean, that's a lot of times when, whether it's an artist or anybody in any career, and they're trying to measure or they're trying to see if, maybe they're asking themselves, am I successful in what I'm doing? Well, you can't be successful if you can't measure where you were and where you are now. Like if you can't have any kind of yardstick to know where you started and even have a plan in place, right? And I guess that's what you're doing a lot with this consulting business is you're putting a plan in place that perhaps they didn't have the ability to do themselves or didn't know they could do.
It's a key component of it is I call it strategic plan, yes, but also tactical plan underneath that, right? So a lot of folk have the vision thing down. They know their purpose. They know why they exist. But strategy-wise, they don't know how they're going to get there. And that can be your 3 and 5 year plan, but some real major milestones. But those major milestones are daunting. And you go, well, how do I even get to the first milestone?
Right.
I'm a big believer in, there's a fellow named Darren Hardy that wrote a book called The Compound Effect. Really simple little book. And he just talks about, we aggregate good things. If we, daily or weekly, we are doing good things. We aggregate them over time. And so you look at what we're trying to do, whether it be health and working out, or whether it be trying to raise more money for the charity that we're working for, or as an artist, trying to get a recording done. When you set yourself up and you work on it, you just take a piece on, those things aren't as simple as I did 1% and I did 1%. No, that's now 2%. Yeah. And then now it's 3%. And usually what happens is when we get somewhere up in that 40, 50, 60% range, it starts to snowball and feel like we've actually accomplished something. And you get to that, 85% song done and you can take it over the finish line, or 85% of that event planned. And now all we have to do is have people show up. And that's the fun stuff. But it's part of my cheerleading role as a consultant is convincing people, you got to do some of this stuff in the early days, and it will pay a dividend. Don't quit.
Right.
Don't quit, because it's so important.
I had a chat with somebody a while back, and it was a very similar type conversation, and they were a really, really busy person. And so I asked the question, so how do you do it? How do you take on new projects and, with everything that's on your plate right now? And his response was, well, if I could just do one little thing towards that end goal, one thing per day, well, at the end of the week, whether you measure it as a 5-day week or even a 7-day week, at the end of the week, I've done 7 things. At the end of a month, I've done 31 things. Those are 30 things I wouldn't have done normally. That put me 30 steps ahead of where I would have been had I done nothing.
100%.
Right?
Yeah, and the only thing I add to that is edit. So my daughter is a budding musician. She's got one song out now, and she does worship leading itinerantly and teaches voice lessons and whatnot. And so, young, energy to burn, all these kind of stuff.
Big vision, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, but edit. You still have to edit to the point where you can't just keep adding one thing to 20 projects and say, okay, now I'm going to have, whatever the math is there, 600 things towards all these 20 projects by the end of the month. It's too much.
Yeah.
You have to figure out what your max is. And so if you get to those 5 or those 7 projects that you can do one thing a day on, and those are all things that are dovetailing and working together, and that takes a ton of work. That takes some reflection time. Ironically, hailing back to our earlier conversation, it takes the ability to rest, because part of what Sabbath or rest does is it allows us to recommit ourselves to the Lord, to realize it's Him that is providing everything that we need, and then allows us to again submit what we're doing to what His will might be for our life. And so we use our natural and our spiritual gifts to live out what He's given us to live out in Scripture and through our community and the things that people are affirming in us. But then I think sometimes we all want to be superheroes.
Yeah.
And I've had to learn the hard way that I'm the furthest thing from that. And you just got to be faithful. You got to be faithful and listen to the Lord and look to the Lord and don't get ahead of Him.
Yeah, I think if you get overly busy, sometimes you can lose focus too.
Yeah.
Right? You get busy and you think you're moving towards the direction that you should be going, and sometimes you need to take that step back, and whether it's on the Sabbath or another time where you just look at it and say, okay, is that really where I'm heading? Do I need to refocus? Do I need to shift? Do I need to do things a little bit differently? Or maybe just reflect back and determine, is this actually working or not? Obviously give it some time, because sometimes there's steps you need to take and you need to be faithful in those steps. But after a certain amount of time, you've been doing it for 2 years and nothing's happening. Well, maybe you're doing it wrong. You can't just continue doing it the same way and it's not working, right?
Bit of the forest for the trees situation, right? You have to be able to step back outside and see, am I actually going the right direction? I'm doing what I think are the right things. Are they actually amounting to the right direction?
Right.
And then you can mid-course correct, you can edit, you can add.
Or intentionally change direction, because maybe what you thought was what you wanted a year ago is now changed.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, so. That's great.
This has been, before we go,
sure.
I have to ask you, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask you this, you hinted that you've got a client that is potentially starting a Canadian Christian worship label. Can you share any details, or is it all hush-hush right now?
It's not completely hush-hush. I'll share a bit of details. Yeah, so that's a fun thing. So you relaunch the business, and the first thing that happens is you have an entrepreneur that wants to start up a worship kind of ministry label.
Right.
And so, it has a name. It's called Song Crest.
Is that crest with a C? Or?
With a C. So you can think of a wave of worship music flowing over Canada. And
or think about toothpaste.
You could if you wanted to, but I don't want
and this
you
has
to.
not been sponsored. This has not been sponsored by any toothpaste company, but just, okay. Songcrest.
So,
okay.
so it's very much in the early stages and big vision for it. And more information. You can go to songcrest.com and all you'll see is a word. We haven't even got a logo yet. We're working on that as we speak. But yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff, a vision to really kind of re-energize, reawaken the Canadian church, the Canadian artist to serving the church with music, with original songs from our context, and also just to really actually emphasize in that character. So we're not after being superstars. We're after being ministers to the church who are actually chasing after growing our own character, growing in the fruit of the Spirit, trying to be examples of Christ-like behavior, and in doing that, encouraging the art in there and trying to re-energize the artists in this country. Give them hope that there's an outlet for their music, that it's maybe less of an industry and more of a ministry, but that's
a novel concept.
Yeah.
Sorry. So how involved, like you're obviously part of the launch of this, but how involved will you be post-launch?
For the foreseeable future, I'll be very involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this will be kind of partly your baby.
I would say that. Yeah.
And would it evolve, given the fact that you're doing the consulting business now, would it end up being what you would migrate to as far as this is what you're now doing for a living, you think? Or will it be still always a side project?
Yeah, I think it'll always be a piece.
Okay.
I think what I've learned about myself, it's taken me way too long, and some of my friends would laugh and say, yeah, we knew that. I need to have a diversity of things going on. And one of the things needs to be music. And I absolutely love the church, and I love Jesus Christ, and I really need to have my some of my efforts into kind of like direct ministry. But I love being out in the marketplace and rubbing shoulders with folk that don't know the Lord and being able to share the gospel with them. And so kind of feeling this call to have some diverse relationships and networks and serve the church, but also share the gospel and be evangelistic in how I walk through the world.
So as far as your music career is concerned, if you are ever looking for a Canadian Christian label, I know of one that's starting up very soon.
There you go.
And if you want to go to songcrest.com, you'll find out all about it.
Yeah, you'll start to see more and more information showing up there.
There you go. Cliff, thanks for dropping by to chat.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Why don't you head over to cliffcline.com and find out all you need to know about Cliff, his music, and what he's up to. And before we go, let's get some artist advice from Bridget Donahoe.
I would say just remain faithful in the small things. So many times we see the end result of a ministry, but really that person or that minister and that you're seeing on these stages and doing all these awesome things for the Lord, all these wonderful songs, they've been faithful with the little. And so when God gives us small things, he entrusts us and he'll grow them if we're faithful stewards of what we have in our hand at the moment. And so I would say just take the time to really hone your craft, learn your skill, be faithful, and just really lean into the Lord and the next steps that he would have you to take.
Remaining faithful in the small things. I think sometimes we like to skip steps. We're impatient, you know what I mean? But we should remember that we need to wait for God's timing in everything, whether it be our family life, our career, in this case, in the music industry, and just wait patiently for what God is going to do. And that is it for this week's episode of Between the Grooves. Aisha's back next week. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll let you know when new episodes drop.
Thanks for listening to Faith Strong Today's Between the Grooves podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider sharing it with your friends, rating our podcast, or giving us some love on your socials to your amazing friends and followers will only help us reach more people. We'd also love to hear from you and share your feedback in an upcoming episode. Send your video or written message to Aisha and James on Facebook and Twitter @Between Grooves, or email us anytime, hello@faithstrongtoday.com.